Welcome to Transcending Comics, a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons, both on panel and behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy, and today we're going to be returning to our Invisibles Community College Book Club series with a very special guest lecturer. Joining me today is a guest who needs no introduction among fans of this show, but they're getting one anyway. They're a writer, musician, chaos magician, and playwright, as well as one of the most prolific names in the comic book industry. They're the mind behind some of the most groundbreaking comics of the last 40 years, including All-Star Superman, Batman Arkham Asylum, Doom Patrol, JLA, The Filth, Multiversity, Seven Soldiers of Victory, We Three, and Marvel UK's Zoids. They've also written mind-bending books like their novel Luda, or their biography of both their own life and the history of superhero comics, Super Gods: What Masked Vigilantes, Miraculous Mutants, and a Sun God from Smallville Can Teach Us About Being Human. Those interested in their recent work can check out art, essays, and short fiction on their Substack newsletter, Xanadoom, or you can pick up their latest comic, Batman/Deadpool, which will be hitting store shelves just days before this episode drops. Today, though, we're going to be focusing on the comic series that changed the life of its writer, as well as countless readers, The Invisibles. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show, Grant Morrison. Thanks so much for joining us, Grant.
Hey, Tommy, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's wonderful having you. It's something I've kind of hoped for since the inception of this show. So this is feeling pretty big for me. So I'm glad to have you.
Here we are.
Yeah, vision made reality for me. Getting right off the bat with The Invisibles here, I'd like to know, 30 years later or so, wherever we're at, how often do you have people coming up to you saying, I read The Invisibles or I read your work and things started happening to me that I can't explain?
Well, it's happened all the time, and it's been happening for 30 years since The Invisibles started, and I guess that was part of what I wanted to do with it. It was a magnet for weirdness, and it was somewhere that I hoped that people could tap into something that I felt was certainly rising at that time and has probably become even more and more intrinsic to the way people think nowadays. So, that's what it was for me. It was just a way of talking about what was going on. And as you say, people still come up to me, people still respond to it, and younger people, even who've only come to it in the last few years, still find something interesting there.
Yeah, if I'm being honest, after reading issue number 3 for the first time, on the day I was going to record the first episode of this podcast, the book incited some kind of altered consciousness experience that wasn't like any drug trip or lucid dream I'd had before that point. And it's honestly what directed me to Arden's work and more or less to this episode happening today. So I can definitely count myself as one of those.
No, fantastic. As I say, it does have a certain psychoactive dimension.
As far as highlights of those years and those accounts, are there any stories in particular that have stood out or any that still resonate with you or feel weird all this time later?
Just honestly, all of it, because it was very much it was an art project to embed myself in the comic story and to become part of it and to see what that would mean and what that would lead to. So the magical elements of it were really profound for me, and I was living out the existence of the comic as I was working on it. So it was like nothing else that I've ever done. I've done other comics that have had magical intent, but nothing had that kind of stickiness and that kind of involving quality that The Invisibles had, because I really just gave myself over to it. I became the experimental subject of the book and just kind of exposed myself to everything in there. If the Invisibles, if a character went to India, then I would go to India. If a character summoned a particular devil or demon, then I would summon that devil or demon and or angel or god. So kind of I was trying to do everything that was occurring within the pages to a certain extent. I mean, I wasn't going to blow things up because I'm a pacifist. But other than that, I was doing my best to follow the line, the philosophical line at least, of the comic book through my real life. And yeah, it was super profound. I can remember so much about those days because I was doing magic all the time. And as I say, it was like David Bowie in LA, it was that kind of really mad immersion in something where you're just in another world completely. But fortunately for me, the other world was also paying my rent. So it was a way to do a an experiment that was actually, making money to pay the cats food. So it was helpful in that way. It wasn't just a ridiculous folly that was going on while my life fell apart round about me. Well, my life fell apart round about me at the same time as I was making a ton of money from the Invisibles and Justice League. So yeah, I mean, I remember all of it. It was very intricate the way the comic book and my life were enmeshed.
I know you've mentioned like using the book as a way of like influencing what would then happen in your life. Like there's the famous hospitalization experience, but then there's also the mention of like using it to facilitate introductions to people, and like this whole globe trotting experience or like the road trip experience across America. And I'd love to know if you can say like, who were some of the people that you met through using the comic as like a means of shaping your life?
Well, just a ton of people. I mean, certainly people like Richard Metzger and Doug Rushkoff, and a lot of people on that kind of counterculture scene in America whose work that I'd actually read and had been following without ever meeting them. But through the Invisibles, I met a lot of people like that. And again, on the British counterculture side, there was people like David Mitchell, who was the publisher and writer, really interesting character. And through him, sort of people like David Conway and those writers who were around, Stuart Home at the time, and Steve Aylett, who were alternative young writers at that period in the 90s. And so they all kind of entered my circle, and they were very big inspirations and influences on how the Invisibles developed. So yeah, there was a ton of people. Once that started rolling, and once I opened the floodgates to, I want to meet people through the comic. And, people in bands and stuff like Sice, the singer from the band The Boo Radleys at the time, was a big fan, and Crispian Mills from Kula Shaker was a fan. There was lots of people who were into the Invisibles at the time. So yeah, it became an open door for me to meet a lot of my cultural heroes. There are a lot of people who were on the same wavelength as me.
Now, I think the most famous story around the book is the Kathmandu experience that influenced like the message you were trying to share. And I won't make you recount that here since it's been discussed on this show and a million other places. But as someone who's had something akin to that, or at least like the, I don't know, shamanic, like holy guardian angel experience, or like just ego death and then altered states from this book, what advice do you have for folks that have just been through an experience that just totally shatters their understanding of consensus reality and like are looking for some kind of anchor or like what to do with this? Because like what I had as a 28-year-old having that was the interview you did on Kevin Smith's podcast 10 years beforehand, and like no other cultural touchstones yet.
Well, I mean, as you know, you have to deal with it somehow. A lot of people have this experience and become born-again Christians because they don't have any other framework to deal with it. So they imagine that they've been contacted by a higher power, which is Christ or God. So you'll see a lot of people who have a spontaneous experience who will suddenly decide that that's what it is. It's like a contact with Jesus. There are other people who've had this experience and who react to it negatively and can interpret it as a satanic attack or a demonic attack. So it's just a case of kind of having a wider cultural viewpoint, I think, to understand that what you're going through and what's happened to you has happened to thousands and thousands of other people in history. And a lot of them have written about it, and a lot of them have noted down how it felt. And you can go and check all these accounts and realise that you're not alone in it. And I think that's the important thing, is to know that what's happened to you isn't completely so radical and individualistic that no one in the world has ever experienced anything like that. It's a very common upgrade of human consciousness. And so you can go and you can understand how other people dealt with it, and it's helpful to learn, to read out those accounts and kind of learn how people approached it and how you can possibly approach it yourself. But as you know, it's an absolutely shattering experience. It takes a lot of thinking about. It took me years and years in the Invisibles and in other comics, and I'm still unpacking a lot of that information and how it felt, and the lightning stroke of data that was just intense, like stuff that I'd never thought of before or never imagined before. But for me, it became a creative opportunity. I think it's always useful if you have a creative outlet that you can put this kind of experience or these kind of feelings into some piece of work that then can make it useful and pass it on to other people. I mean, I'd like to think that anyone now who has this experience could go and read The Invisibles, for instance, and see a bunch of characters having similar experiences and how they relate to it and how they interpret it. But everyone will interpret it differently. Everyone has a different cultural gloss and different filters that we use, and so it's a case of educating yourself and not being caught up in one particular explanation for what's happening, because I don't think it has one particular explanation. I think it requires a prismatic approach.
I've had moments reading certain things, or just like when the synchronicities align, where I start to get this like anxious, shaky feeling that like I'm going to find myself back in that experience, or like I'm going to write my way back into that experience. Like I'm going to bring it about somehow. Is that something you ever worried about as you were working on The Invisibles or other comics, or like approaching 2012, that like somehow you would incite that experience for your past self, or like find yourself living in it again?
Well, no, because for me, the experience was pretty much entirely positive, and I would do anything to live in it again. You know, it was spectacular. I really enjoyed it. So again, that was never something I was worried about. Everything that I tried to do was to recreate it as much as possible. You know, using the comics, using the way that time and space works in comics to try and explore how time and space worked in this experience. So no, I've been trying to recreate it as best I can and make a simulation of it, because it was so, it was just spectacular, as I say. It was amazing. I would quite happily experience that again. And I presume that when I die, I will experience something like it again, because that's how it felt, you know. So I don't know. I mean, did your experience leave you with a trepidation, or was it more fearful or frightening?
It had a little bit of everything. I would describe it as like one of the best and most meaningful experiences of my life, but like I also experienced my own death a bunch of times, and like the kind of shamanic dismemberment, but via lawnmower, and like there was
a
lot of fear around that, but it's still something I would like to be back in, or something I could go through again. Like I came out of it being like, okay, I just died a bunch of times, and now I'm not really worried about the next time I die. Like, okay, what's one more? And so, yeah, like I maybe would prefer more positive, but like there was plenty of positive to balance the negative. So I wouldn't call it a bad trip, just like an extreme one, and one I wasn't expecting on half a tab worth of acid. Just that's how it happens.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I honestly, I find it quite delightful, you know, that sense of dissolving that you get when the ego goes. There's something I really like about that, you know, the notion of melting away and just letting go feels great.
Did you ever wonder if your abduction experience was at all instigated by like specifically the end of Animal Man, since in a similar way you have Buddy encountering the aliens that created them, and then like the famous breach of the fourth wall as they meet you? So did you ever wonder if that was like part of why it happened, at least in the way it did for your experience?
I don't even know if it's the why of it. I think it's more like a hologram, in the sense that if you look at a life, you can extract any moment of that life, and it kind of contains everything within it. You know, I think I always knew this was going to happen. I was doing stuff in my work about this kind of thing even before it happened to me. You know, when I was writing the Zoids comic at Marvel UK, which was a toy tie-in, and one of the ideas I had later on in that was the notion that, okay, it's a toy tie-in, these are toy robots, and I thought, what if they actually are toys? Like, for real? And who would play with toys that are like 300 feet tall? And so I got into a similar thing, which then I explored in The Invisibles later, the notion of these higher dimensional beings who might use, you know, giant robot monsters as toys. So I think it was always there. It was part of my mind. It was always kind of orbiting this notion long before it happened to me. And I'm sure it's because events like that, which are so epic, it's probably the most important event in my life, that it sends ripples back through your history and forward through your history, and it affects everything. You know, it affects the fact that I grew up loving stuff about aliens and spaceships and UFOs and mysteries. I think that all just comes backwards from that moment of revelation, and it affects everything that you do, as I say. So yeah, it's in everything.
On a similar note, I wanted to ask about something you had mentioned on the Prop and On podcast appearance you did earlier this year, relating to the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel experience. But before I get into that, would you be able to briefly explain to our audience what that is?
Well, there's a lot of different approaches to it. I mean, the thing with magic is it can be interpretive as well. So there's various approaches to the Holy Guardian Angel, but the Holy Guardian Angel is the notion is of almost like a higher version of yourself, which you encounter at a certain point in magical development. And on the Kabbalistic tree of life, this occurs at Tifereth, which is the solar center of the structure. So it's seen as a kind of personal sun, a kind of inner light and an inner energy that powers the rest of your magical career. So this thing tends to appear at this particular time. And it's like I say, it's like an exalted version of yourself. It's like a future version of yourself, which has kind of worked stuff out and has got to a place that you want to get to. And it's almost as if it comes back and shows you how to get there. So it can appear in various different ways. You know, people see literal angels. People will sometimes see versions of themselves, or people will sometimes have, generally it's accompanied by a vision of time and space, and it gives you a new understanding of time. It's also accompanied by an understanding of sacrifice, usually via the image of Christ. And you start to get this notion of what Christ is really all about and what that symbolism is about. So those are the two markers of how it appears. And as I say, it's almost like it's finding your magical self, your magical voice. It's like that moment as a writer or as an artist where you suddenly drop your influences and become your own person and your own self. So that's what it is. There's various ways of looking at it, and yeah, for me it kind of happened in Kathmandu and in the area round about that, and it involves like an actual, encounter with Christ, or at least with a state of consciousness that felt like Christ, and a bunch of other things, that were in there, and it expressed itself through the Invisibles series. That was my Tifereth work, that was my solar consciousness self work, and the Holy Guardian Angel abandons the magician on the brink of the abyss, which is another ordeal that magicians go through on their scrabble up the tree of life or along the magician's path towards non-dual divine consciousness. But yeah, that's how it came for me. It came as this vision of all time and how time works and what I am in relation to time, and the fact that all time is simultaneous. So I got all of this information at once, and I didn't actually see a being, but there were various kind of creatures and various things that took the place of this upgrade, because that's all I think it is. It's a consciousness upgrade. It's very much like when children learn to see perspective. This is like learning to see time. You learn to see the fifth dimension. So it is just a perspective upgrade, and I think that because it feels so unusual that it comes across as an alien incursion, and the imagery that comes with it tends to feel alien or very unusual or from a higher or hyper dimension. But I think it's just a new way of seeing that is so all encompassing that it changes everything.
With the idea of it being like a higher or more future self, this was something I was just reading about in Jeff Kripal's Superhumanities, like going back to the original Superman with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and like this idea of willing backwards in time, or like extending one's will backwards in time. Do you think this is something that like an individual has to make a conscious effort to do later in their life? Or is this just like the result of their actions they take after receiving such a vision, or something that happens along the way?
No, I think it's good to do it afterwards. I think it's good to close that circuit, and especially in terms of magic, if you're going to be a magician, then it's a specific choice, and it's a choice to do things. It's a choice to learn about a way of relating to the world and then to practice that way of relating. So if you're a magician, you really should do magic. You should be doing a lot of magic all the time. And yeah, I would definitely say that you would do it in that circumstance. You would certainly pick a moment and go back and send yourself back to meet yourself. I mean, I've done that, where you feel I'm at a point now where I'm like the intelligence that contacted me when I was having this experience in the past. So let's just send back a signal to make sure that the circuit is closed.
Do you mind if I ask how you plan to do that for your past self?
No, I mean, I've already done it. I mean, I've already been through that thing. I mean, I did it long before I crossed the abyss, and it was just a case of sitting down and meditating and going back and saying, hey there, it's me. Do you remember?
I'm glad to hear it's a low-intensive ritual if you hit that.
No, well, it was certainly low, and it was certainly easy for me. You know, I just lay back in a chair and projected myself back into the past and said, hey, how you doing?
Now, I know The Invisibles is like the definitive example of the hypersigil, right? The progenitor of that term. I'd love to know what other works you found since its publication from other creators that have been hypersigils or like been made with that intention.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's for the creator to tell us, you know. I mean, I know there are certainly things like, I mean, back in the day when we worked on Robbie Williams' album, who's the British singer,
Mhm.
it was a big deal all around the world, but not so much in America. But we worked on an album.
Yeah, he's the singing monkey, right?
Yeah, he's the singing monkey in that monkey show. And but we worked with him on an album where it was kind of creating tarot style images for the album. And he did that album as a hypersigil. That was very early because I'd sat and talked to him about what a hypersigil was. And, you know, and I know that Arden's record that she did recently was definitely designed as a hypersigil. But as for other artist creations, I don't know. I'm sure people do it all the time. And I'm sure people did it before me, but didn't give it the catchy name, which has managed to stick and attract people. But yeah, I mean, any long form work where there's a deliberate intent that is a magical intent, and the work is extended through time and isn't just a single glyph, then it can be a hypersigil. Like I say, you can have a ballet, you can have a play, you can have a TV series, you can have a movie, you can have a record. As long as you have that dimension of time in there, and you also have the audience reaction, which is really helpful. The great thing about The Invisibles was that it was coming out every month, so people could kind of hook into it and come back over years, you know, every single month and send letters in and kind of involve themselves in the process of it, which was really helpful to me and in terms of creating it and as a hypersigil.
Over the years, you've mentioned attempts to adapt The Invisibles to film and TV, and that some of these have taken a very different approach to the material, like having Ragged Robin as the central character.
Mm-hmm.
Since the series acted like as a hypersigil that drastically affected your life to the point of almost killing you, like, do you ever worry about the consequence of revisiting a hypersigil like this or adapting it to another medium so many years later?
Not so much. I mean, and I have, as you say, I've adapted it several times now. I've done like maybe 5 or 6 completely different versions of an Invisibles pilot and of an Invisibles movie, and they're all different versions, you know. So I have done it, but no, I never felt that at all because I felt that when that originally happened, I didn't really have defenses. I wasn't aware that it could happen, and I wasn't aware that it could happen quite so extravagantly. So now, anytime I do things like that, I've got a lot more protection, let's say, like magical protection. So I'm unlikely to blunder into anything like that ever again. And it was really instructive. It was worth doing at the time, and I was young enough to take it. But I certainly wouldn't want to get myself into that kind of web of trouble again.
One of the main things that drew me to The Invisibles, like, as soon as I knew I wanted to start doing this podcast, like, I was talking with Charlotte Fierro of Extra Issues and My Marvelous Year and found out there wasn't a trans comic book podcast specifically yet. And of the first few books that I looked at, like, Lord Fanny and The Invisibles was like what really made me want to dig into this one. So she's the favorite of this show. You've mentioned that Lord Fanny was based on your own experiences of going out or performing rituals while presenting as a woman. And I'd love to know if those experiences in your life have made their way into your other work.
Yeah, I mean, they're all over the work, you know, even going back to the early days. I was always introducing trans characters. Back in my Zenith comic in 2000 AD, There's a character called Meta Maid, who's, I think, probably one of the first trans superheroes, and she's just this fabulous looking character who actually saves the day and survives and doesn't get killed. And this is in the 80s, but because a couple of the dumber characters make a couple of jokes about her, the character was just written off as transphobic. And I was always really upset about this because this is from the 80s and it's a strong, powerful superheroine who's trans. And I wish people knew more about her. So, yeah, I mean, I was always putting the characters like that in there, and Rebus in the Doom Patrol was this kind of weird intersex character. And then with Fanny, I was trying to just reflect kind of the way I liked to dress at the time, and also just the people that I was meeting when I was going out, because I was doing a lot of clubbing at the time, and there was just this fantastic kind of gay club called Love Boutique that we used to go to, and there was there was a lot of trans and drag queens there, so it was kind of reflective of those people. I was just trying to write about the kind of world that I came from and the counterculture kind of milieu that I came from, or the demi-monde or whatever it was.
Were there any other notable trans friends or drag queens in that scene that, you would say had a strong influence on the way you depicted the character?
Well, all of them. There's a whole sequence in there where one of the bad guys is beating a girl up in the toilets, but you see the others talking outside, and they're talking to Fanny, and they're talking to some of the other characters, and a lot of those were just based on people that I would bump into in clubs. And they were always just, it was just that's kind of, here's my world, I want to see it represented on the comic page, because you didn't see it back then. You didn't see it on television, you didn't see it on comics unless they were there to be victims.
Your novel Luda, I feel like, takes place in a very similar scene with the UK drag scene. And I was curious if you ever thought about directly tying that into the Invisibles, or having any Lord Fanny references in there, since, I mean, our characters go to the exact same kind of parties I'd expect to find a young Fanny at.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the difference is that in Luda, the city of Gasglow is a kind of dream city. It's where I go at night, and it's where all my dreams take place. Whereas the Invisibles, I was really trying to set it in the real world. And that was one of the reasons, because we wanted the magic to be, again, quite sticky. So to have real events and real incidents happening, like the death of Diana is in there. There's a lot. You'll see Marilyn Manson and Pamela Anderson and other figures of the 1990s. So the thing about the Invisibles, we were trying to make it seem as if this was really real, and that this could be happening behind the scenes, that you might just, bump into one of these people in the streets, but you wouldn't know. Luda, on the other hand, as I say, is set in a sort of dream world, so the characters are never going to meet, but there's a lot of crossover there. Obviously, there's a lot of that. The magic that I was doing back in the 90s was completely, rooted in drag and glamour and those notions of being able to conjure a completely different world just by performance, really.
I admire the way Lord Fanny is depicted in, we see her outside of the makeup and going around with a very masculine presentation at times. And I like seeing this level of control she has over her life and presentation. When we see her young life, she had so little control. But I know that's maybe contentious to some people reading it now, with her having the trans label, but sometimes seeming closer to the realm of a drag performer. So I'm curious, if you were writing the book today, would you change the way you present the character at all?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, I think if I was writing it today, then yeah, there's more information, there's more language that can be used. But I wanted Fanny just to be herself, or and sometimes himself. Fanny wasn't intended to be representative of any group, and and I don't think Fanny's even necessarily trans or drag. We don't know what Fanny is. Fanny is her very own self. And that's what I was trying to get at, because I was very wary, obviously, of there's so many shades on the spectrum of trans, and there's different ways of approaching it. There's different ways to do that. And you don't want to be the person who's trying to claim that this is the only way, or that this is the one way to do it, because then it alienates a lot of people. So for me, it was just, here's a character who's like people I know, and that was the best way that I could do it, rather than making the character political or have the character having something to say about specific issues. I just wanted to present the character for who they were, and we could see that they were heroic and funny and cool and sexy, and just let that be without making the point, you know. And I think nowadays you'd be more likely to try and make a few points. But back in the day, I just wanted to have this heroic, lovable character, and that was the point. And they were who they were, and you just had to accept that sometimes they were this, and sometimes they were that, and sometimes they chose to do this, sometimes they chose to present this way. But Franny was only ever herself, just like Luda in the book. That's all I could do, because I can't stand in the position where I'm able to talk for a wide range of people who all have different experiences.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate that perspective, and that someone was bringing a trans or a character under that umbrella to life in that way so early on. And I think that's something a lot of people trying to write trans characters now could learn from, of making them not representative, but instead just an individual having their own unique experiences.
Yeah, I think because that's what everyone is, you know, and but I understand, you know, because some things that people almost do feel that they have to represent and that they have to put across the entirety of something or only the best of something and never show the negative aspects of it. But I think, as I say, I think it's better just to let your character be who they are, and even if they have problematic elements, that just acknowledge that, because everyone does.
Now, the arc of Invisibles that I find myself drawn to the most, or revisiting as I become more literate in literally the world of literature, is the Arcadia arc. And
Yeah.
I know that was more contentious when it came out, but I'm curious if like Byron and the Shelleys were ever going to be a bigger presence throughout the rest of the comic.
I think because Arcadia was actually the first story that I came up with on the Invisibles. It was originally going to be a graphic novel on its own, and it was never going to spin out into anything, but it was the very first idea that I had, because I was very interested in the Romantic poets, and I just read a huge book about the French Revolution and de Sade's role in that. So I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, and just the notion that utopian ideas tend to always end up in, you know, a welter of blood and mud. And so it seemed like that was worth investigating. But yeah, I became part of the Invisibles. I think there was going to be more with Byron and Shelley. In fact, there was even talk of doing them in their own, you know, mini series or something, like Byron and Shelley, the Brave and the Bold. It was that kind of thing. But yeah, there was an idea to do more about them, but it just didn't work out. Initially, the notion about the book was more likely to be like that the first 10 issues or episodes, where we were doing a lot of different stories. And sometimes, you know, there'd be the story about the monster in Balmoral Castle, and then the next one there'd be the one about the security guard who gets shot. And I think there was going to be a lot more of that, the kind of procedural, you know, monster of the week thing. And the invisible characters would only show up every so often, a lot more irregularly. But once I wanted to boost the sales figures, the idea came about to just focus on the team and to really make it more like, you know, okay, these are the X-Men, this is the team, you're going to see them every issue, we'll get to see those soap opera lives. And that kind of crowded out the other characters that might have showed up. You know, there might have been another story arc with Byron and Shelley, but it just didn't work out because I decided to focus on the main cast of characters.
Do you recall any other historical figures you had in mind for that incarnation of the story? Like, I come from a computer science background, so my tie to them is Ada Lovelace, since like one of the progenitors of the computer. And like, with where the series goes with like the simulation or like the video game Robin is playing, I can totally see that connection of like second generation Invisible Cell inventing the means for this to come about.
Oh, definitely. I would do that now, you know, because for another project years later, I had a really good Ada Lovelace idea, and I wish I could use it. It's just a classic notion. And if I can find a way to use that, but that would have probably been in the Invisibles at the time. Yeah, I'd have definitely used her, but I didn't know much about Ada Lovelace back in the day. Surprisingly, you know, I knew about Byron and Shelley and Coleridge and the Romantics, but I wasn't really following the exploits of their kids.
Can you say anything about the Ada Lovelace story?
No, because it's such a good idea. Someone will just steal it, so it'll show up somewhere. I'll let you know.
Yeah, I have to say, though, that the Arcadia arc is part of what makes this like one of my favorite comics, since the partner of mine that you'll hear on the first few Invisibles episodes, Ari, she's very much like an English major and like my poetry expert. And like here I'm reading a comic from like who she knows to be my favorite writer. And then she's like, wait a minute, what's this now? And I know maybe 90s comic people weren't ready for Arcadia, but 2020's poetry lovers are absolutely here for it. And like, that like really became a touchstone, or like our bridge of, okay, now I can understand what you're telling me about Marquis de Sade and Salo and like the classic poets, and you get this window into my world. So yeah, it really did a great job bringing an outsider into comics.
And just that the whole that whole kind of strand of romanticism and the way it's fed in and out of literature and in and out of American literature as well. It seems to be back a little bit again. So I've always found it fascinating. You know, I think these characters are very, very modern writers. You know, when you read that stuff, it feels very of its time, but very contemporary as well.
Now, the final sentence of The Invisibles that people will hear in today's outro is our sentence is up. And I've heard you describe that as the fractal around which the entire series worked. And I'd like to know at what point in the planning and creation of The Invisibles that you had the realization for this as like the final sentence or like the core of the series.
Probably quite near the end. And usually these things happen at the very end, because there was a bunch of different ideas for the ending of The Invisibles. I've got a notebook where I'm getting close to the conclusion, and there's about 5 or 6 different final pages, and they're all completely different approaches to how to end it. But I think the sentence is up was just the one that it seemed the most obvious one, because I went back to that notion of us being jailed and being trapped, the Gnostic notion that we're trapped in the material world. And the idea of being jailed and the sentence being up, obviously the sentence and its meaning as a grammatical term, and at the same time its meaning as a legal term. And the fact that the sentence was up as well seemed to suggest a kind of rising, a utopian feeling. You know, it wasn't like your sentence is down, it's like your sentence is up, which seemed quite nice. So it fit in a lot of ways, and once I had it, it just seemed like the only way to end that book. It definitely had to end that way. And even when we see the sentence, it closes on the period at the end, obviously that black circle. But what there actually is there's a quotation mark which is left virtual in the whole thing. So the whole series, everything is contained within quotes, and that was another part of it as well.
On that ending, like, you know, with this being a hypersigil affecting your life and showing this end of existence on December 21st or 22nd of 2012, did you perform any kind of magic that day or do anything special when that day came? And if so, do we have you and the Invisibles to thank for the world not ending in 2012?
Well, I don't know. I think the world might have ended in 2012. Honestly, I think you could make a case for the world taking a turn for the worse. But yeah, I was doing magic on the day, of course, because it was such an important end day. I didn't honestly ever think that the world was going to end that day. I thought what it was just an interesting. It was a placeholder for a feeling, for an idea, and a notion. But I definitely do believe that the world that we knew prior to then has ended. You know, we do live in a world where, as I've said before, the barrier between what is real and what is illusion has completely collapsed now, and it's now that we have Sora 2 videos, it's been annihilated. And that was something that the Kabbalists talked about, you know, the notion that the earth, the material sphere of Malkuth, would be drawn up into Yesod, which is the sphere of imagination and illusion. And it's happening. To me, there is just no doubt about that. And I knew that was likely to happen after 9/11, because those 2 towers on the moon card are representative of the gates between reality and illusion. So once they were down, it was obvious that this process was going to take place. And while all of that is metaphor, what we're seeing is the actual reality of how those metaphors are playing out. And as I say, the distinction between the real and the unreal is now, it barely exists, and I think that's part of the invisible spell, and as I always say, you set these things in motion and you don't quite know where it might end up. You can bring down an avalanche, but my feeling is that things are going the way they're meant to go, but it might have to go through a pretty thorny period to get there.
Do you have any memories of the day itself, or like how you spent it, like as far as specific magic or just anything you did just in case?
No, honestly, I was all set for it. I mean, I was quite happy if Horus had descended in a fiery chariot. So I wasn't bothered about it. I knew everything would be fine, so there was no concerns. But I just sat there, kind of like, okay, if it's going to happen, make sure I get to see the good bits.
Now, you've mentioned how the main characters in The Invisibles were based on who you were at the time you were writing it, and like how that shaped the story and the locations of the book. And I'd like to know what you think the book would look like if you were working on it today. Like, would the characters be different and based on who you currently are, or like how would you be reflected in them? And like, well, how would their methods or personalities have changed?
I don't think it could exist today. Certainly not in the way that it did. The 90s were a very bright time. We just ended the Cold War, which really felt amazing. It felt like this sense of nuclear threat, which had existed through my whole life, was gone. And that idea of gigantic forces in America and Russia facing each other across the world with fingers trembling over buttons was suddenly gone, and it just felt great. So obviously all it ever was a hiatus. It was a pause in hostilities, which then started up again. But for around 10 years almost, there was definitely a sense of infinite possibility and this kind of science fiction feeling. And we had that alien head glyph started to appear, and the X-Files came out, and there was a lot of interest in conspiracies and stuff. So it just seemed that there was a certain flavour and a certain feeling of those times, which was very positive. The dance music was pretty upbeat. The psychedelics were MDMA and ecstasy and things like that, which again promoted a kind of togetherness, a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood and everything else hood. So there was a really, like I say, a very, very progressive and positive feeling at the time. And again, coming out of the 80s, when the 80s were quite repressive and regressive in a lot of ways. There was a lot of, it was kind of like what we've just seen recently. There was a lot of cancellations and a lot of people being put under the spotlight. So to see it emerging from that, like I say, there was a feeling of infinite possibility, and I'd just come out of a long relationship myself. So for me, it was like the world had opened up a bit, and I was doing a lot of traveling. So I don't think that anything like that could happen now, and I'm a lot older now, so you don't take the chances that you might have taken then. And it would be a book of research now, whereas back then it was a book of, this is what I was doing, this is how I was living, this is the people I knew, here's the magic I'm doing, here's exactly what I did, here's the god that I met, here's the demon that I met. Nowadays I'd be kind of just making it up and go down to the library and looking up books, rather than just getting on a plane and going there. So no, it couldn't happen. It wouldn't have the vividness, and it wouldn't have the life, and it wouldn't have the sense of somebody actually going through this. And you know what? I almost died and stuff. If I almost died today, I would actually die. I wouldn't survive it. But back then, I was able to survive it, which again went straight into the Invisibles, and I was able to use everything that happened to me at the time.
I'd like to take a moment to discuss the legacy of The Invisibles within your own further work. And it's been said that The Filth acts as like an unofficial sequel to The Invisibles.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to hear more about the connection between these two works, or like if there is any kind of official, like these exist in the same world, or how these two stories touch.
Well, there is. I mean, but I wanted to keep it. I wanted to keep it vague and not state it outright. But I was thinking of back in the day, one of my favourite shows is The Prisoner, Patrick McGowan's show about the spy who's trapped in this village. And it's very surreal, 1960s kind of op art and brainwashing. It's super cool. But before that show, Patrick McGowan played a secret agent called John Drake in a show called Danger Man, which was known as Secret Agent Man in the USA. And a lot of people thought that The Prisoner was a sequel to Danger Man because he's an unnamed spy in The Prisoner who's is intending to resign, and suddenly he's captured and subjected to all these bizarre, like, mind techniques to find out why he wanted to resign. So that, based on this notion that the Prisoner's a kind of unofficial sequel to Danger Man, I thought The Filth is an unofficial sequel to The Invisibles. And there's a panel in The Invisibles where King Mob and what's her name from the Poison Pussies?
Let's see.
Jolly Roger.
Right, yeah.
And so they're up against Quimper, and they have these hallucinations of being trapped in sort of hideous, degraded worlds. And there's one where we see King Mob sitting, he's got a beer belly and his jacket's hanging off and he's sort of out of shape and he's just watching television. There's an eye just watching back from the TV. And I noticed that panel and I thought, well, that's the story, isn't it? There's a story after The Invisibles where King Mob's just this guy and he's just sitting watching TV and he's forgotten who he is. And the filth kind of grew out of that panel, plus a bunch of other ideas that I had for different things, for different series. And I put them all together and created The Filth. So basically, Greg Thiele in The Filth could be King Mob. That's who it could be, just being subjected to this bizarre brainwashing technique to try and separate him from his dangerous alternative persona. So it can be read like that, but I don't state it outright in the book at all. But it can sort of be read that this is really King Mob.
In your Disinfocon speech back in the year 2000, like, you had brought up the whole point of, like, what do we do from here? We kill the eye. And I feel like The Filth shows a dozen different ways for how that goes wrong, or like the worst possible collective consciousness outcomes. Was this meant to be like an antithesis to that way of thinking that you were in when you were finishing The Invisibles?
Yeah, because The Invisibles was very upbeat, and it was, as I say, it was coming out of that 90s feeling of expansion and oceanic kind of escape from something. And then it became obvious that things were going to kind of go back. I could see it around about 1997. I remembered seeing the change in pop culture, and there was a darker element coming in. So I thought I kind of had to look at that. And although the Invisibles winds up with pretty much a hopeful apocalypse, it seemed important after it that I remember thinking, well, just because my life's doing great and everything's working out well for me doesn't mean that it is for everyone. So I need to talk about that. I need to talk about a world that isn't just fireworks and balloons and utopia. And so I decided to use The Filth to talk about it. And because I was having a good time in my own life at the time, I just met Kristen, my future wife. So everything felt pretty great. So I felt that I was able to look at the darkness that was in The Filth and to look at some of those ideas that I would never have really wanted to toy with prior to that. I felt I was able to look at them from that position of doing okay. So yeah, I saw The Filth as a kind of inoculation. I knew things were going to get bad and I thought I needed to tackle them early on. But pretty much everything that I thought about in there kind of did happen. That weird pornification of things and the kind of the focus on darkness and the focus on the filth and on cynicism.
Well, in response to The Filth, I have someone that's made an interruption to the podcast. I think they knew I was feeling bummed about the loss of Greg Thiele's cat. This is Giovanni, or Gio for short. Yeah.
Hey, Gio, how you doing?
But there were like a few visual connections that I was curious about in The Filth, specifically like with the crab and the people traversing the 2D comic worlds for the hand. And I was wondering if there was any intentional connection to the Harlequinade there, since it seemed like they could be playing a very similar role, or that like the Harlequinade could be doing just that in The Invisibles.
No, I mean, obviously you're allowed to have any connections you want. If you see a connection, it's probably there. But no, the Harlequinade, yeah, I can see why you would do that. You'd make that connection. But the Crab crew were kind of just based on the girls from Cabaret, from the musical Cabaret. And that was the idea, that inside the crab was just like the Kit Kat Club, and they were all dressed in those kind of those Weimar Republic kind of stripper clothes. So there wasn't really anything much beyond that vague idea. But no, if you want to believe that they are the Harlequinade, feel free.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like those are some of my big questions coming out of the Invisibles. Like that pitch document for Volume 3 mentions that, like, oh yeah, the reader should come away knowing the true identity of the Harlequinade and like what the Hand of Glory is, or if it belongs to Sir Miles. And I wondered, like, could you spell that out for us? Or like, I'd love to know what the current Grant would explain as like the definition of the Harlequinade and the Hand of Glory.
The Harlequinade are just what they seem to be. They're emissaries from that higher world. You know, they're emissaries from the fifth dimension, and they just occupy what look like human bodies and interact with human beings at certain places. And that's who they are. The Hand of Glory is a cursor.
Mm.
And it's how it appears in our world as a severed hand, but it's actually a cursor inside the simulation. So it can move around and click on different places in time and space and take the wearer or the bearer of the hand anywhere in time and space, the way a cursor can cross a page.
So is it kind of like the hand of the reader then as well, since that's like our way of traveling through time throughout the Invisibles?
Not so much, because the hand of the reader's occurring outside the framework of the Invisibles. This is within the framework of the Invisibles, where we recognise that the comic book and the events that we're watching and that world which exists, where those characters exist, is not real, that it's a simulation. And it is a simulation because it's a comic book, you know, so there's layers of irony there. But yeah, the Hand of Glory is the cursor within the simulation inside the comic. It doesn't necessarily relate to the reader's hand.
Also in that back matter, I know that you mentioned the Invisibles being picked up in a way in the unpublished novel, The If. And I've seen the snippets of it that have made the way onto your Substack, and they've really piqued my interest. So I'd wonder if you could tell our listeners anything about what you had planned for that book and its connection to the Invisibles.
Well, I mean, the idea for that one was just to kind of take some of the thoughts that I'd developed in the Invisibles and take them to the next level. So it was a group of where the Invisibles are kind of individualistic and almost punk rock. The If were a bunch of young people who were based on those, like the Midreach Cuckoos and the Village of the Damned kind of thing. But it's a bunch of kids who are identical, and they all have blonde hair and strange glowing eyes. And the If had kind of based themselves on that. The If stood for International Front. And it's very like the Invisibles, but in a different way. They were a lot stranger and colder, and it was very much about a collective notion again, in the way that the Filth was exploring different collective notions, because I saw that as the only way to proceed beyond the kind of idea of the individual and those notions that had come from Romanticism and even from the Enlightenment before that, about the sovereign individual and the potency of the individual, which I just thought were leading us down the garden path now, and were leading us to kind of ill health.
I found it interesting, like the similarities, like between what you described as a war between parents and their children, and like the bridge there between that and the movie Mom and Dad that you had a cameo in. Was there any like intended connection or like inspiration there, or was that just like a complete coincidence?
No, I guess that was a coincidence, because I know that Brian Taylor hadn't read any of the If. But yeah, you reminded me that the If was really about a war between parents and children. I thought it was the ultimate war, which has always interested me. You know, it's there in the X-Men, but it's basically youth versus age, you know, and it's constantly recycling and evolving. So yeah, that was a big thing about the If, was this notion of what happens if children just decide they've had enough and start a war against the grown-ups, but doing it in a very subtle way, at least to start with. And for me, that all came out of just reading a ton of stuff about infant animals and young chimpanzees and about the very notion of youth itself and where it came from and the way it was kind of sentimentalized by the Victorians. So I just got into the idea of pitching a battle between youth and age that was quite literal. But no, mum and dad, that was in a different way because it's almost like zombies, they become possessed and they want to do, this was just, the kids have had enough, they just had enough and they decide to fight back.
I read the excerpt of the If yesterday, and then in the evening, I got some friends together to watch that movie as like a way to get my energy up and prepare for today. And like, well, I love the movie, and Nicolas Cage is great as always there. I couldn't help but think like, oh man, this movie could have really used like a bookend of sequences like this, like with this whole evolution of like the creation of the universe to being but a piece of toilet paper being discarded. And I would have loved to see that like grander view of things. So yeah, I do you think we'll ever get to see the If come to life in the future?
I don't know. I wrote a lot of it, so I don't know. It would be nice to get back to it again and finish. And I have gone back to some stuff and started finishing it off. So there's always the opportunity that I could do that because there's a lot of material there, and there was a lot of good stuff. There was quite a wide range of interesting ideas.
Now, like, as someone who's made as much work as yourself, what usually leads you to decide to put something down for a while or prevent yourself from like pushing yourself through to finish it regardless?
It's weird. It doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes it'll just happen. Like this H.P. Lovecraft story that I'm currently serializing on Substack. I've had that for 30 years. I wrote the first bunch of chapters like 30 years ago for a reading at an event. And it's sat around on my computer, and every few years I'll go in and add a new bunch of lines. And it's unusual for me to do that at all. But there are a couple of things like that where I'll go back and just keep adding to it, and there's, if something's still got a hook, if something's still got an interesting flavour, then I'll tend to go back and look at it. So yeah, I mean, it's funny you should mention the If, because I was thinking about it again, and I thought there was a lot of really good stuff in there that could be salvaged.
Now, if I can get my timing right for this episode, I may be able to release this on the 30th anniversary of the Save the Invisibles Wankathon on November 25th.
Oh, wow, nice.
Yeah.
That gives us another good excuse.
Yeah, like for listeners that don't know, I mean, this was the movement that like put a sigil on the letters column that, allegedly saved the book from cancellation. And as far as just like putting something out there for the will, getting this collective action of like intention and effort to do something 30 years later. Do you have anything you would suggest for the listeners of the show? Like, hey, put your intention to this, or if we're going to go with the Invisibles method, think of this.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a few things, but I don't want to name any names. I don't think we should. There's a few things we should tackle, but nothing in particular. I think we just need to basically herald the coming of Maat, the goddess of truth, harmony, and balance. I think anything going towards manifesting Maat in the world would be really helpful right now. And she is due for a comeback.
Yeah, is that the next of the Sekhmet cycles you've written about?
Well, no, it's not the Sekhmet stuff at all. It's from Aleister Crowley's idea of the precession of the aeons, and he talked about the earliest aeon of recorded human history is Isis, and then there's Osiris, and then there's Horus, and then comes Maat, and each of these has a potentially 2,000-year lease. So the first 2,000 years it was the aeon of Isis, and time was cyclical in the sense that there was a mother goddess, and things were based around agriculture and seasons and the turning of the sun and the moon. Then you get Osiris, who's the father god, and that's the dawn of the legal world and the world of the word, which has been the last 2,000 years. So the most important things are Bibles and laws and statutes, and the individual becomes super important, and time stops being cyclical, it becomes linear, and it's seen as an arrow of progress. And then you get Horus, and Horus is the disruptor and destroyer, the child god. And so again, Crowley talked about Horus coming in around about the First World War. For me, that Horus really showed his metaphorical head when 9/11 happened and the towers came down, and that's when, for me, everything really began to change, and all the old structures began to disintegrate, and the old religions began to fight back as they felt the end approaching. So I think that's what we've been in. We're in this Horus time, where this young golden god who's just destroying all the former things that we could rely on, the structures and the systems that we could rely on. And after him comes Matt, who's the sister, who's truth, harmony, and balance. And it's kind of, I think we need a bit of that now. I think we've seen enough disruption. So I'm hoping that the energy of Matt will show up quicker, because she's kind of operating a shadow Aeon alongside Horus, and she can crop up at any time. So if anyone wants to do mass magic, I would just say to try and emphasize those that kind of current, the current of truth and harmony and balance is probably a much better thing to aim for right now than disruptive energies.
Yeah, I think that's a great intention to put out there. I would like to ask about some specific things in some of your other work while I've got you. And one of the freakiest synchronicities I had in researching your other work was in Seven Soldiers and the Guardian issues, where the train sequence underground, one of the characters mentions Iamu, or Iamu am I, as the words God spoke when he created it all. And I'd like to unpack this a bit, because that was like a specific phrase that had appeared for me in a few like weirder experiences I'd had. And like, to you, where does this Iamu come from? Or like, what was that pulling from when you were writing that?
It was during a magical operation that I was involved in, and I said to God, "What's your actual name? What's your real name?" And the reply I got was, "I am you, who am I?" Is what it was actually pronounced as. And interestingly, I then found out that the name Jove and Io and those kind of words that were used for God by the Greeks and the Romans were based on that shout of yo-ho or yoo-hoo. You know, it's the announcement of presence. And that's where we get our names like Jehovah and Yahweh. It comes from this yoo-hoo, Yahweh. You know, so I just felt that I was onto something, because that was what he said. I am you, who am I? I am you, who am I? You know, and it makes sense in like 1,000 different ways. You can play it over and over again. It's like a Zen koan, where if you think of it, and there's just a whole ton of different interpretations of that phrase. But that's where it came from. It was me asking directly, you know, what's your name?
Okay, like for me, it was something I kind of found in the chemically altered experience at a music festival, like at least a seed of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I read the third issue of The Invisibles and like had this weird visionary altered state the next day, that was the word I found myself chanting as I came back, was Yamu.
Oh,
and
wow.
I had not read Seven Soldiers and wouldn't for another year or so after that. So that was like, what is this? When
well, as I say, I mean, I think we're all in this hologram together, you know, and so I think things often overlap and synchronize.
I'm wondering if you can put some fear to rest I've had that's kind of inspired by that. Like, okay, if we have Iamu is like the name of God, or like the first sentence of sentience, or like, you know, like the Om, like the first sound of existence.
Yeah.
It leads me to understand that there's like an opposite of that. And I don't think it would be I am not, because to not like implies to am or to be. And like, that's, I think, what I have this subtle fear of stumbling into as I get into like weirder states. And like, I've described this as maybe like what the anti-life equation is, or like just whatever the opposite of Yamu is. And I, like, as someone who's written in weird states, I'm wondering what you can say to like that fear of discovering something you shouldn't know, or something that'll like undo your existence, or like if this is the first sentence of self-awareness, I'm afraid of finding something that makes you realize you no longer exist.
Yeah, well, I mean, that will happen, you know, it'll happen to everyone. But no, at the same time, it's not something that tends to concern me at all. You know, the notion of not existing or existing. I'm trying to think where I would go with that. That's the hardest question of all, isn't it? Yeah, when some consciousness says I am you, who am I, it's the moment of awareness, right? But in magical thinking, there's a level of awareness above that, where that question doesn't get asked, because we become a non-dual consciousness. A non-dual consciousness doesn't have subject and object. It just is. It's like a transparent presence, and within that presence is absolute creativity. You can do anything, but you're kind of not doing anything at that time. So the answer to the question is, I am you, who am I? Is like, I am you means that there's somebody else out there that you're talking to, like the voice in your head, which you think is you, but it kind of talks to you as if there's someone else there. And the minute you say, I am you, who am I, you're predicating a subject and an object. So you've stopped being God at that point. So when you say, I am you, who am I, what is not you is everything, and this is what I was talking about, this notion of the individual. The individual puts a bounded line round all of us, and it says, okay, I am this thing, and everything else is everything else, and I will relate to everything else as this object. Even though the object that is you as a person is actually constantly exchanging matter with the rest of the universe, we're constantly breaking down, we're constantly taking on new atoms, and we're breathing in air. We're in constantly kind of fluid dialogue with the gases and the liquids that surround us. So I think that one of the big mistakes is that we do, but we do it deliberately. It's the magician's pointing finger. It's the wand, is to try and find the individuality within a universe that's actually one. It's one thing. The universe is the only individual here. But in order to understand it, we point fingers, we define things, we separate them out and think, okay, here's a mouse. Let me understand what a mouse is in relation to the rest of this. But that forms the problem, that suddenly by saying that I am an I and an individual, then everything else is not me. And so those things can either be threatening or non-threatening, or, it becomes the 3 Fs. It's fight, flee, or fuck. And that's how we relate to everything else, because we have set ourselves up now as being, there is us and there is the rest of things. So, I mean, for me, it's, as I say, there's not a worry that when I make a position and I draw a line around myself and say, I am a magician, here is my wand, I specifically, as this element separate from the rest of the elements, will now try and make either control or dance with or have some relationship with the universe that was formerly unusual. So I don't get worried about there's a non-self. Of course there's a non-self. Everything is non-self. And part of magic is also to dissolve that and to just dissolve into the larger picture and to realise that you're part of everything. And in a very pragmatic and practical way, not just in a kind of philosophical manner, that we're all part of everything. So there's nothing that's not us, except when we decide to draw lines around things in order to examine them. So that's it's a long and complicated answer to that, but that's how I feel. I don't worry about what is not me, because everything is not me.
Yeah, I think that's what I needed, and I appreciate the long answer to that, since it's the one I'm both excited and afraid of at the same time, or like the one that I think drives a lot of what's at the heart of what I look to create with my own artwork. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and as I say, you will encounter things as you move on, whether they seem like entities or intelligences or consciousness or just ideas that are unpleasant and ideas that are pleasant, and it just depends how you choose to work with them. You can as you know, you can take ideas that are unpleasant and make art out of them as well. So it is all about, how you as a bounded self respond to the input that comes at you and how you choose to respond to it. Some people like to confront darkness, and process it.
As far as like having artwork as a guide through all of this, and like especially in our early days, I'd love to know what you would put at like the heart of your love of comics, or if you specifically have like one core memory of like your early comic book experience that's kind of shaped that love, or like what you first think of when you think of like the origin of your love of comics and desire to make them.
Well, I do, fortunately, and it was a Flash comic. And it was issue 163 of The Flash. And it's quite famous because the image on the front is the Flash's head, sort of like me, like this, and he's holding up his hand. And he says, please buy this comic. My life depends on it. And I just thought, that's just brilliant. What an idea. Like the Flash, when I was a little kid, I see this and the Flash is yelling out to me. And what a great way to make you buy the comic, what a great advertisement. But the fact that he was calling out to me, like, suddenly made the Flash real. And the fact that I had to help. I had to buy the comic. I had to read the story in order to save the Flash's life. Made me really important. So it felt great that I was being taken seriously by my favourite superhero. So that was the one for me. And the story in there is about a bad guy makes a machine that stops people remembering that the Flash exists. And as people forget who he is, he actually physically fades away and he turns into this really weirdly drawn kind of drifting fog, which is coloured in red and yellow. And he just can't. People are just blowing on him and he's drifting through the streets and he barely exists until one little kid, who's the only person in the world who remembers him, kind of remembers him back to life. And that for me was the origin of all of this, the notion that the comic itself was somehow alive, that the characters could talk to me, that I could interact with them, that by believing in something you could make it real. All of it was in there. So for me, that was kind of my secret origin as a comic book. Once I read that, I just knew I had to do this somehow eventually as a job or get involved with this in some kind of way. And that one contains the seed of all the kind of philosophical ideas that I've explored in comics as well.
Now, I'd be remiss if, meeting you this year in the same year James Gunn's Superman comes out, to not at least ask you about the subject. And plenty of people have asked you about Superman elsewhere, so I won't talk about like All-Star and like the connections to the movie. But I would like to know, like, with Superman as the symbol of like hope, or like what we're supposed to aspire to be, and like more your description of like supposed to inspire action, right, rather than just frivolous hope. Like, what would Superman do in the face of America's current political climate, with deputized men in masks taking people from their home and any number of other horrible things that are going on like an institutional level?
Well, the reality of Superman, if Superman was real, he wouldn't like any of that, but Superman's also someone who tries to fit in with the laws of the country. So Superman takes all that stuff seriously. That's what people think of him as, a Boy Scout sometimes, because he's not entirely a vigilante. He started out as a vigilante who would just run about causing all kinds of trouble, and then he became slightly deputized. So the real truth is Superman I think he would just speak out about it. I don't know if he'd take a lot of action, because Superman's not the kind of person who punches down, really. I think he would speak out about it, certainly. But in the world of Superman, I don't think it would even get to this place. The world where Superman lives is a nicer place, and there's lots of superheroes there, and people seem to have a better attitude towards everything, purely because they're surrounded by people who do the right thing and who do good. So I just don't think it could happen within that fictional universe, the kind of troubles that we are going through right now. And if it did happen, people like Superman and Batman would be doing their best to tell people what was right and wrong, and whether people would listen to them or not then is the thing. Superman doesn't really use his powers to impose his will on people, so that's the trouble. That's why Superman doesn't change the world. That's why Superman doesn't just go in and smash up the government buildings and install himself as king of the earth. I mean, he'd probably make a better job than everyone, but it's not his thing. As I look at it, Superman and all the superheroes, their job is to catch us when we fall, and it just depends if we've fallen far enough yet for them to catch us. I don't know. Don't know.
Now, for our closing question, I like to tailor it to the guest's particular interests. And in prepping for this, I really enjoyed watching the TV adaptation of Brave New World that you worked on as a writer.
Great, yeah.
And yeah, it was great inspiration to get me to finally read Aldous Huxley, so I could get that out of the way first. But I really loved how you reimagined that work to reflect the modern world based on such an older dystopia. So I'd love to know if there are any other works from the writers that have influenced you, like Huxley and Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick, that like you would particularly love to adapt to television in a similar way, or even with a team.
Well, I did an adaptation on Island, which is Huxley's other great kind of utopian book. And I really loved that. Honestly, that was one of the best things I've ever done. But it's Hollywood. You do these things, you get paid, and then they just float around for decades sometimes, and they might not get made. But that was definitely one I'd love to see done. That seems really relevant to the world we're in right now, and it would be a great thing to see. But in terms of other things, now I know Brian Taylor was working on something with Illuminatus, as well. But again, so many of these things, they're very big, demanding stories, and sometimes the studios are just running scared. I think right now studios are they're living in terror because of AI and where the movie business is going to go next. Everything's very different now. So I don't know. No, Island would have been the one that I wanted to do, and Brave New World. I wish it'd gone on because we had some really good ideas for it, but they just didn't get that final episode right.
Could you speak to that final episode, or like where that went for you?
Well, it was originally supposed to be 10 episodes, but they spent a lot of money on it, and they spent all the money for episode 10. So I'd written episode 10, which was the last one, and suddenly we couldn't do it. So episode 9 had to become episode 10, and it's got my name on it, even though I didn't write a single line in there at all. And it just wasn't. There was a lot of stuff that was just done that didn't fit the storyline at all. I didn't like the way they did the Epsilons. The Epsilons shouldn't have been morose, kind of like Metropolis style workers in overalls. They should have been happy all the time. They loved being workers. They loved being labourers. So there were a couple of things like that I thought just didn't work, and they kind of erupted in that final episode, and it just didn't do what it was supposed to be doing. I didn't think the kind of the way that played out worked at all, and it didn't really help us because we didn't get renewed thanks to that final episode, as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, a lot of it was good. I thought that the opening was good, and I loved the fact that we did the Savage Lands almost as where would America go, and it's even more like how we predicted, because the idea was that the America of the Savage Lands, people would die at age 30 because the place was so environmentally degraded. Everyone was really sick, and things like it cost like $3,000 for a Mars bar because inflation was so bad by this point. And so there's a lot of things that I thought were really good. That there'd been 15 presidents in the last 5 months because, again, the government was just barely holding on. And a lot of that I thought was the satire in it was pretty good. But we just got that one season out of it, which was interesting.
Well, I still quite enjoyed it. And yeah, that Savage Lands sequence, like, it's maybe the best I've ever seen an adaptation save the most problematic element of its source material. So yeah, great job.
Yeah. We
But Grant, where can our listeners of the show follow you for any of your upcoming work?
I just check out my Xanadu, my Substack. I do it every week now, and you don't have to be a paid member. I've decided to open it up to the whole world, so people can come in and check out just kind of newsletter every week, and it's also got a lot of new fiction and prose stuff, and anything new that's coming out gets announced there first. So that's the best place to look.
All right. Yeah, check that out. And I can vouch for that myself. I've been a big fan of Xanadu since subscribing shortly after starting this podcast. And there's a lot of great resources there. That's how I found Arden Lee's work. And that's also been a wonderful resource. So check out Xanadu, folks.
Yeah, please do.
Thanks again, Grant, for joining us today. This is something I've hoped could happen since I first started doing the show. So this is a dream come true, frankly. So thank you so much for making the time today.
No, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that, Tommy.
Thank you for listening to Transcending Comics. If the listeners at home have requests or recommendations for comics or creators you'd like us to cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Transcending Comics Instagram and Facebook page, on Twitter as @TranscendComics, or find me on Blue Sky as @TommyTrimbath, or email us at transcendingcomics@gmail.com. We'd like to thank you for giving our podcast a chance and give a special shout out to Ray Day Parade for designing our logo. Our intro music this week is A Little Soul by Carlson. Our outro is Become Invisible by Lisa Crawley. Special thanks to Dave and the folks at the Imperious Rex YouTube channel for allowing us to use their theme song as our outro. If you'd like to support the show, please leave us a review on your podcatcher of choice, or consider supporting us on the Keymaster Collective Patreon page, the recently launched production studio behind Transcending Comics, Giant Size Violence, as well as 2 other upcoming podcasts, and our various comic book and art projects. Join us again next time as we continue transcending boundaries and exploring the colorful world of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer representation in comic books of all kinds. As the curtains fall on this episode of Transcending Comics, remember that comics have the power to inspire change in countless worlds, including our own. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep transcending.
And so we return and begin again. The world turns a key. It's the start, it's the end. Our heads are all the same, large enough to contain the God and the devil, a palace, a rebel. Our sentence is up. It's time to go and let yourself become invisible. Create your heaven here on earth. Think if the unthinkable. Find your truth within the light. Jump off the edge and start to fly. Time to wake up, time to wake up, and say goodbye.